Welcome back, guys, to Java Space. We have seen a lot so far. We have talked about monitoring outside of Spring. We have seen how to integrate your Spring application with Prometheus, and we have seen how we can take those metrics in Prometheus and send them to Grafana. And we also talked about the role of micrometer in all this monitoring and observability. But we have not talked about Spring Boot Actuator as yet, in terms of how to configure it, how to create your own custom metrics, etc, etc. So in this video tutorial, we are going to talk about Spring Boot Actuator. We are going to look at all the endpoints, what they mean, how you can do your own customizations, etc. So Spring Boot Actuator. As we said in our previous videos, to get started with Spring Boot Actuator, all you need to do is to put Spring Boot Starter Actuator as a dependency in your project. And by so doing, you are pulling everything that is required by the actuator and all the dependencies to your class path. So I would like to show you this actuator. I'm just going to control click on it so we can see what it has inside. As you can see, it has Spring Boot Starter, it has micrometer observation, it has micrometer Jakarta 9, and it also has auto configuration, which means once you have it in the class path, then Spring will auto configure it for you to give you some basic configurations. So you see that you don't have to implement anything, as we have mentioned before. So what are the available endpoints that when you put your Spring Boot actuator into the class path that you automatically get? So we see that we have beans, which actually gives you all the beans that your Spring Boot application have created. Then we have env, which gives you information about system environment, like whatever is accessible through the environment. You talk about system variables, environment variables, property files, etc, etc. You will access them through this env endpoint. Then you have conditions. So these conditions are the conditions that are applied to your auto configuration classes. Say for instance, you will want to configure data source when we have Spring data in the class path, things like that. So those conditions you will see all of them in this endpoint, like those condition classes. Then you have the health endpoint, which actually gives you the state of your application. Is your application running up, down, and all that? Then you have the info endpoint, which is just a generic endpoint. Like you can use it for any information. So by default, this endpoint is empty, it has nothing. So you can use it to expose information like the build of your application, what version your application is running, what Java version and stuff like that. Then you have the loggers endpoint, which exposes information about the log level of your application, log level in different packages, etc, etc. And also this endpoint is useful when you want to update your log levels at runtime, as we will see during the demonstration of the Spring actuator. Then you have configprops, which is actually information on the configuration classes, like the classes that you annotate with at configprops will appear in this endpoint. Then you have the mapping endpoint, which exposes all the request mappings that you have if you have Spring MVC in the class path, like your controller classes, all those mappings in your controllers, they will appear in this endpoint. Then you have a metrics endpoint, which exposes metrics about your application. We are still going to dig deep into this one. Then you have the shutdown, which is quite a dangerous endpoint, to be honest. And this endpoint, you can use it to shut down your application, and it's disabled by default for security. But you will notice that most of the other endpoints are enabled by default, but this one is disabled by default. Then you have another endpoint called session. So this one shows all the user sessions available in your application. And if the application is using Spring Sessions, Spring Sessions will allow you to now externalize the state of the application, either into a database. Let's say you are running application, we have a lot of users logged in with fish, and all those things, and your application all of a sudden goes down, and there is no way for you to retain all the sessions in your application. So if you are using HTTP session in your application, you can save the state into a database, so that when, as I mentioned, the application goes down, the app doesn't lose those sessions. Then you have the thread dump. I made a mistake here. Let me correct it quickly. Then you have the thread dump, which will show you the thread dump of your application. Then there's another endpoint called jolokia. I don't know how to pronounce this, jolokia. But this endpoint allows you to expose JMX beans over HTTP. So there are quite a number of these endpoints available. We cannot talk about them, about all of them. If you want to see all of them, I have left a link for you here at the bottom. You can just visit that link, then you will see all the available endpoints. So we mentioned that some endpoints are exposed, some are not exposed. Some are enabled, some are not enabled. So we want to look into this exposed versus enabled. So if we say an endpoint is enabled, it means that the endpoint has been created, and the corresponding bean for that endpoint is available in the container or in the application context is available. So all endpoints on the over HTTP are enabled by default, save for the shutdown endpoint. As we mentioned, the shutdown endpoint is disabled by default. Then let's talk about exposed. So when an endpoint is exposed, it means the endpoint is accessible to you either via JMX or via HTTP. But an endpoint that is exposed must have been enabled before. So for HTTP, or only health endpoint is exposed by default. And we saw that all endpoints for HTTP are enabled by default, but only health endpoint is exposed, which means you can access it. For JMX, all endpoints are exposed. All endpoints are exposed, and all endpoints are enabled. But you must enable JMX first by specifying it in your configuration by saying spring.jmx.enabled equals to true. So that means, technically it means that all enabled endpoints are exposed, but you must enable JMX first. So HTTP protocol is available only if you have Spring MVC in the class path. You talk of WebFlux, what else? Jesse, Spring Web basically. If you have Spring Web in the class path, then you will have access to HTTP endpoints. For JMX, as I've mentioned, protocol, you will have to enable it through the configuration to have all those endpoints enabled by default. So we saw that all endpoints are available through the base path actuator / but there are cases where you would want to change it, maybe for security reasons. You don't want anyone to guess your application to say, oh, they have this application is Spring. They can actually guess where the actuator endpoint is. So you can change it. And the way to change it, you say management.endpoints.web.base-path, you give your new name. Once the new name has been set in the configuration, to access your individual endpoints, you will say /new name plus the ID, which the ID would be a specific endpoint, could be health in this case, which means if we want to access the health endpoint, we would say new name /health. As we mentioned, health is enabled and is exposed by default. Health is exposed by default. And we know that as much as we can apply security on our controller endpoints, it is also possible to secure our actuator endpoints. So we will see about that in the upcoming lecture. Thank you.